There is a truck sitting in a scrapyard outside a small town in Ohio right now. 3 flat tires, a cracked engine block, paint peeled all the way down to bare primer, rust creeping up through the floorboards like it's trying to swallow the whole thing whole. If you drove past it, you probably wouldn't even slow down. You'd think it was garbage, something waiting for the crusher. But 70 years ago, grown men lined up outside dealerships before sunrise just to get their name on a waiting list for this exact model. Women wore their nicest dress to go pick one up, because owning one didn't feel like buying transportation. It felt like buying a piece of the American dream. For almost 2 decades, if you wanted to know how well a family in this country was really doing, you didn't need to ask. You just looked in their driveway. This was the truck that meant you had made it. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. This same truck, the most beloved vehicle in American history, came so close to complete extinction that for close to 2 years, executives inside the very company that built it were seriously debating whether to kill it off forever and never build another one again. Not because people stopped loving it. Loving something and being able to save it turned out to be 2 completely different problems. This is the real story of the rise, the almost total collapse, and the impossible comeback of America's most iconic classic truck. Stick with me until the end, because the moment they almost pulled the plug for good is something most car channels will never even mention. To understand how something this loved could almost disappear, you have to go back to the beginning, right after World War II. America was rebuilding itself from the ground up. Soldiers were coming home by the millions. Factories that had been stamping out tanks and artillery shells overnight had to figure out what to build next. And for the first time in a long time, ordinary working families actually had a little bit of money in their pockets and a lot of ambition about where to spend it. What they needed was something that could survive a farm during the week and still look respectable enough to park outside church on Sunday. Up until that point, trucks were treated as pure tools. Ugly, uncomfortable, loud, built for function, and absolutely nothing else. Nobody expected a truck to look good. Nobody expected a truck to feel good to sit in. If it hauled hay and didn't break down, that was considered a success. But one manufacturer looked at the entire category completely differently, and they asked a question nobody else in the industry was even bothering to ask out loud. What if a truck could be tough enough to survive a job site, but nice enough that a man would actually be proud to park it in his own driveway right next to his neighbor's car? That single question, treated almost like a throwaway idea in an early design meeting, ended up changing the entire direction of the American auto industry. The truck that came out of that idea wasn't just functional anymore. It had rounded fenders instead of harsh flat panels, a wide, friendly-looking grille instead of something that looked like it belonged on a piece of farm equipment, a cab that actually felt like a place you wanted to sit instead of a metal box you were forced to tolerate. It looked like it had personality, almost like it had a face and a mood. And America noticed immediately. Sales didn't just grow steadily the way they usually do with a new product. They exploded. Within just a few short years, this truck stopped being some niche work vehicle bought only by farmers and contractors. It became a full-blown cultural symbol. It started showing up in movies, not as a background prop, but as part of the story. It showed up on farms in every single state in the country, in every small town, parked outside diners and hardware stores and county fairs. Picture a young farmer in Nebraska in the early 1950s, saving up for almost 2 years, driving 40 miles into town just to sit inside one at the dealership before he could even afford it, running his hand along the dashboard like he was touching something sacred. That wasn't a rare story. That was happening in thousands of towns across the country at the exact same time. For an entire generation, this truck wasn't just transportation. It was proof. Proof that you had land worth working. Proof that you had a family worth providing for. Proof that you had built something with your own 2 hands that you could finally be proud of. And the company behind it understood exactly what they had on their hands, so they kept pushing the idea further instead of sitting still. They introduced a wraparound windshield years before most of the competition even considered it, giving drivers a view of the road that felt almost futuristic at the time. They introduced factory options that had never been offered on a work truck before: comfortable bench seating with actual padding, a heater that worked reliably in the middle of winter, even a factory radio for the driver who wanted a little music while hauling feed across 3 counties. None of this sounds remarkable now, but at the time it was almost unheard of. Trucks were supposed to be stripped down and uncomfortable. This one dared to treat the working man like he deserved a little comfort too, and buyers rewarded that instantly, walking straight past cheaper, plainer competitors just to get one with a little bit of style. Competing manufacturers scrambled to catch up, and for a while, almost nobody could. Other companies rushed out their own rounded, friendlier-looking trucks. But they always seemed to be chasing a trend instead of setting one, and customers could feel the difference even if they couldn't always explain it. There's a particular kind of brand loyalty that gets built in exactly this window, in the earliest years of a category, when one company simply gets there first and gets it right, and every competitor after that is forever compared to the original instead of judged on its own terms. That is precisely the position this truck locked itself into, and it held on to that position for decades without any serious challenger coming close. By the 1960s, this single model line had become one of the best-selling vehicles in the entire United States. Not just best-selling truck, best-selling vehicle, period, ahead of sedans, ahead of every competitor's entire lineup combined in some years. It showed up in Hollywood films as the vehicle the hero drove, never the villain. It became quiet background scenery in car chase scenes, parked outside diners in nearly every road trip movie of the era, practically a supporting character in American pop culture without anyone officially casting it that way. Kids drew it in school notebooks. Toy companies rushed out miniature versions of it for Christmas because parents kept asking for it by name. It felt completely untouchable. It felt like nothing could ever knock it off that mountain. But here's the part where most people stop paying close attention, because on the surface, absolutely everything still looked perfect. Sales numbers were still strong. Dealership lots were still full of eager buyers. Magazine covers still praised it every single year. And that surface-level success is exactly the problem, because underneath all of that shine, 3 completely separate storms were quietly building at the exact same time, and almost nobody at the company saw all 3 of them arriving together at once, like a perfect storm nobody had modeled for. The first storm was the oil crisis. Almost overnight, gas prices more than doubled in some regions. Gas stations had lines wrapping around entire city blocks, and Americans who had proudly bought big, heavy, thirsty trucks for over 2 decades suddenly couldn't afford to keep filling them up every week. A vehicle that had once been a symbol of success now quietly became a symbol of a monthly bill people dreaded opening. People who used to brag about their truck's size and power started quietly asking dealers what the mileage actually looked like, something almost nobody had cared about just a few years earlier. The second storm was regulation, and this one hit even harder behind the scenes than most buyers ever realized. New emissions standards and new federal safety laws slammed into the entire auto industry all at once, and older truck designs, the very designs that had made this model into a legend in the first place, were suddenly considered outdated, too heavy, too inefficient, and far too expensive to bring up to code without a complete and painfully costly redesign from the ground up. Engineers who had spent their careers perfecting one formula were suddenly being told that formula no longer met the law. And the third storm, the one that actually scared company leadership the most, was arriving quietly from overseas. Smaller, cheaper, remarkably fuel-efficient trucks from Japan started landing on American shores, and buyers who once wouldn't have dreamed of driving anything but an American-made truck were suddenly, for the first time in the brand's entire history, cross-shopping. Dealers started reporting something they had genuinely never seen before: loyal customers walking in, looking at the new models, running their hands over that familiar hood one more time out of habit, and then quietly walking right back out the door to go compare prices somewhere else down the street. The company that had built the single most beloved truck in the country was now watching its own most loyal customers seriously consider walking away. And for the first time in decades, nobody inside that company knew how to stop it. What made it worse was that these three storms didn't hit one after another where the company could deal with each problem separately and catch its breath in between. They landed almost simultaneously, stacking on top of each other in a single brutal stretch of just a few years. Fuel prices spiking while regulators demanded heavier, safer, more expensive designs. At the exact same moment, smaller and cheaper imports were finally reliable enough to trust. Any one of these three problems alone would have been manageable. All three at once felt, to more than a few people inside that company, like watching a slow-motion collision they simply didn't have the tools to steer away from. You would think that's basically the end of the story. A truck this loved, brought down slowly by bad timing and bad luck outside anyone's control. That would already be a sad story. But it wouldn't be an interesting one, and it definitely wouldn't be the reason this story is still worth telling 70 years later. Because this is exactly the point where the real story actually begins. Behind closed doors, inside boardrooms that regular customers never saw, the company was falling apart internally in a way the public had absolutely no idea about. There were two very different camps forming among leadership, and they were in a genuine, sometimes brutal fight over the truck's future. One camp argued the writing was already on the wall. Cut losses now, quietly wind the model down over a few years, shift all available resources towards smaller, cheaper, more fuel-efficient vehicles that could actually compete with the imports on price and mileage. To them, this wasn't cruelty, it was simple survival math. Why keep pouring money into a design that the market itself seemed to be walking away from? The other camp argued something completely different, something that at the time sounded almost reckless. They believed the truck wasn't actually dying because people had stopped loving it. It was dying because the company had gotten comfortable, complacent, coasting on 20 years of success without innovating fast enough to keep up with a changing world. Killing it now, they argued, wouldn't be admitting the market had changed. It would be admitting defeat before they had even tried to fight back properly. For close to 2 years, this argument raged on internally while sales kept sliding in the background, month after month, a slow bleeding wound that everyone inside the company could see, but nobody outside could fully appreciate yet. Reports that surfaced decades later revealed just how close the cancellation camp actually came to winning that fight. There were internal memos drafted, early wind-down timelines sketched out on whiteboards that got erased before outsiders ever walked into the room. Production numbers already being quietly reduced at certain plants in preparation for what many insiders assumed was the inevitable, sad, undramatic end of an American icon, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a slow, quiet fade until one day the model simply wasn't on the order sheet anymore. Meetings reportedly got tense. People who had spent their entire careers on this one model line were now being asked to justify its existence in front of executives who saw it purely as a line item on a budget spreadsheet, a number that was trending in the wrong direction no matter how much history or loyalty sat behind it. Engineers who had grown up idolizing this truck, who had bought their very first vehicle from this exact lineup as teenagers, were suddenly sitting in rooms defending its right to keep existing, arguing passion against pure financial pressure, and for a long stretch of time, it genuinely wasn't clear which side was going to win. This is usually the darkest point in any comeback story, the moment right before everything either falls apart completely or turns around in a way nobody sees coming. And this story is no different, because instead of quietly discontinuing the model or letting it slowly fade away, production year after production year until nobody even noticed it was gone, a small group inside the company made one of the riskiest bets in automotive history. Instead of playing it safe, instead of protecting what was left of the budget, they convinced leadership to tear the entire design apart and rebuild it from the ground up, from nothing, as if they were starting the whole idea over again from scratch. They didn't just tweak the engine and hope for the best. They completely rethought the underlying philosophy of what this truck was even supposed to be in a changing world. Lighter materials were brought in to directly fight the ongoing fuel crisis, cutting weight everywhere engineers could find it, without sacrificing the toughness buyers still expected from the name. A completely modernized frame was designed to satisfy the brutal new safety and emissions regulations without losing that unmistakable rugged feeling that had made people fall in love with it in the first place. And most importantly of all, they focused everything on bringing back the one thing the cheaper imports could never fully copy, no matter how efficient their engines were. That unmistakable American presence. That specific feeling of driving something built specifically for this country's roads, this country's jobs, and this country's sense of pride. One engineer who worked on that redesign later described it as feeling less like updating an existing product and more like defending a family member in court, except the family member couldn't speak for itself, and every decision made in that process would either keep it alive for another generation or bury it for good. Every single component got questioned. Every panel, every bracket, every inch of wiring got weighed against two brutal competing goals that seemed to directly contradict each other, make it lighter and cheaper to satisfy the new fuel and safety rules, without making it feel smaller, weaker, or less serious than the trucks people had trusted for over 2 decades. That tension sat behind almost every single decision made during that redesign, and there were entire weeks where teams disagreed so strongly about which trade-off was worth making that prototypes had to be built 2 or 3 different ways just to physically compare them side by side before anyone would commit. It was an enormous, terrifying gamble, and everyone involved knew exactly what was riding on it. If this redesign failed, if buyers rejected it the way they had started rejecting the old model, the truck that had once ruled the entire American market would quietly become nothing more than a footnote, a cautionary case study taught in business schools decades later about beloved companies that simply didn't adapt fast enough. There would be no second chance after this, no more redesign budget waiting in reserve. No more patience left from leadership who had already spent 2 years arguing about whether to save it at all. It didn't fail. It became one of the greatest comeback stories the automotive world has ever witnessed. Sales that had been quietly sliding for years reversed course almost immediately after launch, faster than even the most optimistic engineers on the redesign team had dared to predict internally. Loyal customers who had already started test driving imports came right back, some of them reportedly canceling orders they had already placed elsewhere the moment they saw what the new model could actually do. And an entire new generation of buyers, people who had never even seriously considered a pickup truck before in their lives, started buying in for the very first time, drawn in by a version of the truck that finally felt modern without losing what made the original special. What could have easily become the quiet obituary of an American icon instead became the opening chapter of an even bigger legend than before, one that eventually pushed this nameplate past every rival on the market, not just among trucks, but across every single vehicle sold in the country, a title, remarkably, that it still holds on to today, decades after that terrifying 2-year argument almost ended the whole story before this chapter ever got written. Walk into any classic truck show today, anywhere in the country, and you will see the direct result of that one terrifying decision made all those decades ago. Rows and rows of these trucks, lovingly restored, some kept bone stock exactly the way they rolled off the factory floor, others customized with modern engines, dropped into that same unmistakable body, lowered suspensions, fresh paint in colors that never even existed in the original catalog. Owners will talk your ear off for 20 minutes about a single detail, a specific trim piece, a specific badge, a specific dashboard knob, because to them, this isn't just a vehicle. It's a piece of family history. Ask around at one of these shows and you will hear the same kind of story over and over again with small variations. A grandfather who owned one when it was new. A father who bought a rusted, barely running example decades later and spent years slowly bringing it back to life in a garage on weekends. A grandson who inherited both the truck and the obsession, and who is now doing the exact same slow, patient restoration all over again on a completely different example he found for almost nothing in a farmer's back field. That's the part of this story that almost never gets discussed alongside the sales charts and the boardroom fights. The reason this specific truck became the single most chased classic vehicle for restoration in the entire country isn't only about how good it looked when it was new, it's about what it represents now. Buying and slowly restoring one of these trucks has become its own kind of tradition, almost a rite of passage in certain families, a project that gets passed down the same way an old pocket watch or a hunting rifle might get passed down. Except this one comes with an engine that needs rebuilding and a paint job that needs stripping down to bare metal first. Prices for well-preserved original examples have climbed dramatically over the last 2 decades, turning what used to be an affordable weekend project into a genuine investment for some collectors, while rougher, forgotten examples sitting in fields and scrapyards, the kind most people would drive straight past without a second look, have quietly become treasure hunts for restorers who know exactly what they're looking at underneath all that rust. And that is exactly what makes that rusted-out, forgotten version sitting in a scrapyard right now so different once you actually understand the full story behind it. It's not just an old, tired machine nobody wanted anymore. It's a survivor. It's living proof that being loved by an entire country doesn't automatically protect you from almost disappearing completely, and that the difference between becoming a forgotten footnote in an old sales report and becoming a permanent, unshakable legend often comes down to one terrifying decision made by a handful of people at exactly the right moment, when almost everyone else in the room had already quietly given up. So the next time you see one of these classic trucks rolling down the road, freshly restored, chrome gleaming, proudly parked front and center at a local car show with a little folding chair and a cooler set up next to it, remember what you now know. That truck almost didn't make it here. It came within a signature on a memo of disappearing forever, becoming a story people simply forgot to keep telling. Instead, against genuinely terrifying odds, it became one of the greatest survival stories in American automotive history, and somehow it's still being written today. One more restoration, one more car show, one more grandfather handing down the keys to a grandson at a time.